So this lecture was on chapter 13, which is all about our personality, which definitely is what makes us unique. We all have a different personality. So let's look at some ideas of how our personality might develop in this presentation. So what is personality? Let's define it first. It is the unique and relatively enduring set of behaviors, feelings, and thoughts and motives that characterize an individual. The two highlighted words, it's unique, as we just mentioned, it's what makes you who you are, and it's enduring. It lasts throughout time. It can change, but mostly is the same throughout time. It's not just a moment in time. The quote I included I really like. People often only see one side to someone's personality, but actually there are many different levels. Personality is complicated. It's not just one trait or one behavior. There's many different levels to our personality. So let's look at what Freud thought about personality. He believed there are three psychic structures. There's the id, which is present at birth, includes those biological drives. It's entirely unconscious. You don't have to think about wanting these things. And it demands instant gratification of needs, which you can see that in a baby when from birth they want instant gratification. If they're hungry, they want to immediately be fed. So we want to be instantly gratified of our needs. The ego begins to develop during the first year of life. It's primarily conscious. We think about our needs, and we seek rational ways to deal with delayed gratification of needs. So if our needs aren't instantly met, we seek ways to rationalize that and to cope with that. The superego evaluates our actions in terms of right or wrong. It's conscious. We have to think about that. Is this right or wrong? And it strives to gratify our needs while abiding by moral principles. Defense mechanisms, just to define that, these are unconscious strategies the mind uses to protect itself from anxiety by denying and distorting reality in some way. So this is really to prevent us from having anxiety because, of course, no one likes to feel anxiety. Some examples of defense mechanisms: repression, the unconscious act of keeping threatening thoughts, feelings, or impulses out of consciousness. Often you'll hear repression used related to childhood abuse. For example, someone who was abused as a child may have repressed that memory or that feeling because it's just too painful. It produces too much anxiety. So it's almost your mind's unconscious way of repressing that feeling. Reaction formation occurs when an unpleasant idea, feeling, or impulse is actually turned into its opposite. So, for example, I might say, I don't like her, so I'm overly kind to mask this dislike. So I'm switching the feeling to the opposite so no one will know I have this dislike. Projection. People deny particular ideas, feelings, or impulses and project them onto others. So I might say, I'm having an affair, but I accuse my partner of cheating. So I'm projecting that behavior onto someone else to reduce my own anxiety. So Freud isn't the only one that's developed a personality theory. Some others include Alfred Adler, said that our personality essentially develops because we're striving for superiority. That's the major drive behind our behavior. And people do this in order to compensate for their physical and psychological weaknesses. So he said we want to strive to be the best. That's the drive behind our needs and how we act, is we just want to strive for superiority. Carl Jung believes the unconscious has two distinct forms. There's the personal unconscious, which is our hidden thoughts, ideas, and motives that we personally experience. And then there's the collective unconscious, which is the shared universal experiences of our ancestors. In other words, aggression, our feelings about aggression, how we respond to that, death, survival. Pretty much everything is part of the collective unconscious, shared universal experiences. Karen Horney had some ideas about personality, and she focused more on the social and cultural factors behind neurosis and the neurotic personality. Let's define neurosis. It's a term mainly used today by followers of Freudian thinking to describe mental disorders caused by past anxiety, often that has been repressed. And we just discussed repression, so we know this is past anxiety that we're unconsciously trying to get rid of so we don't have to deal with the anxiety. Horney said this can create neurosis, this can create a mental disorder. She believed that basic hostility, which is anger that originates in childhood due to fear of being neglected or rejected by our parents, leads to basic anxiety, which means we feel isolated due to experiencing the whole world as hostile. She believed that some people are able to respond to this anxiety with normal defenses, but others respond with neurotic defenses, which could be part of a mental disorder. So in this chart, I won't go through the whole thing, I'll just let you look at it, but it has some examples of the neurotic anxiety, or really the unhealthy defense mechanisms. And then it has some of the characteristics of someone with non-neurotic anxiety who's able to respond to that anxiety with healthy defense mechanisms. Neurotic might include this person is has a low stress and frustration tolerance. They overestimate threats. They worry a lot. Someone who has more healthy defense mechanisms probably has a more stable self-esteem. They're more able to adapt to problems. They're more able to rationally assess whether they're in danger or not. So just some examples of whether it's neurotic, in other words, not so healthy defense mechanism versus a person who's non-neurotic anxiety, more healthy defense mechanisms. There are also humanistic positive theories, which these theorists focus on self-awareness and the meaning of life. One of these most popular theorists is called Abraham Maslow, and he really focuses on the concept of self-actualization. Self-actualization is our desire to become the best we can be. That's where our personality derives from, is we want to be the best we can be. You might have seen the triangle before. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is pretty popular. His idea is that first, our physiological or physical needs have to be met. We have to have shelter, we have to have food, we have to have water, and then after all those needs have been met, we can focus on our safety. After we have become safe, we can focus on our social needs. We need social support, we need other people around us. Then we can focus on how we feel about ourselves, our self-esteem, and then we can finally reach self-actualization, which again is our desire to be the absolute best we can be. Carl Rogers is another person who commented on personality. He said people naturally stride toward growth and fulfillment. Unconditional positive regard from others is required for this to happen. And unconditional positive regard is the acceptance of another person regardless of his or her behavior. So he said we need that from other people in order to feel like we've grown and to be fulfilled. Another theory is social cognitive learning theory, which essentially indicates that our personality is consistent over time, which we discussed at the very beginning, that part of the definition of personality is that it's enduring, it's consistent over time. However, it's not always consistent across different situations. I'm sure some of you in some situations are very extroverted, for example, but you might be put in another situation where you're very introverted. So our personality is, again, very complex, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same across different situations. Trait theory. Let's define trait. Trait is a particular characteristic, quality, or tendency that someone or something has. The big 5 traits are listed to the left. You can look at those. And then the facets are just kind of more specific traits related to those big 5. So you can kind of look at that and see what you see in yourself, for example. There are evolutionary biological theories. The evolutionary explanation of personality would be that our drive is to survive and reproduce. Psychological mechanisms further our ability to survive and reproduce. For example, in order to survive, we might want to create alliances with others. In order to reproduce, that's one reason we make ourselves attractive to find a mate, because we want to reproduce. The biological explanation is that personality is simply genetic. Different DNA ultimately produces different personalities. Speaking of genetics and that producing our personality, we of course know that that's not the only producer of personality. There's also nurture, which is our environment. And genetics and environment work together, we know, to produce someone's personality. The interaction between the two can be seen in three perspectives: the genetics, temperament and fetal development, so what's going on while you're developing as a fetus, and cultural influences. Gene studies often try to uncover, or continue to try to uncover, the locations on particular genes that are associated with high or low levels of a trait. This has obviously not completely been done. We haven't identified every gene that's associated with every trait, but gene studies, this is what they're attempting to do, is uncover the particular gene which is associated with a particular trait. Temperament and the fetal environment. The idea is that the prenatal environment may play an important role in shaping personality. For example, if mom is stressed and or depressed while pregnant, that could have an effect on the child's personality. Cultural influences. The fact that there are differences in personality in different cultures kind of lets us know that it's not only genetics that affects personality, because otherwise there wouldn't be personality differences between cultures. Some example of a difference between cultures is some cultures are more individualistic, which means people are more focused on themselves and their own behavior. Some cultures are more collectivistic, meaning these people are more focused on the impact of their behavior on others, more focused on being allianced with other people. So we've kind of looked at the different theories behind personality and how it's defined. How do we measure it? How do we look at someone and be able to determine what their personality traits are? Well, we can do that by simply observing, simply watching the person. What's their behavior? How do they think? How does it look like they feel? The drawback to this technique is that all of the observers may not agree on how the trait they're looking for is displayed. For example, some observers may consider aggression hitting. Aggression is a trait. Some may consider the trait of aggression throwing things. Others may consider it cursing. So something I see as aggression may not be what you see as aggression, and therefore there's going to be disagreement on whether the person really has that trait. You can take it a step further, and instead of just observing the person, you can talk to the person. Now your source of information is what the person says, obviously. The drawback is similar, though, in that different interviewers may interpret the same answer differently. So I may interpret what you say as aggression, whereas somebody else doesn't. There are projective tests. So instead of the person talking about themselves, a person might be asked to discuss what they see in an ink blot, which is the Rorschach ink blot test. Or they may be able to tell us a story in response to a picture, which is the TAT, or thematic apperception test. These tests are often used by psychologists to identify perhaps certain unconscious themes, things that you don't realize about your personality that are there. I included an example of both the Rorschach test, which is on the left, which, as it mentioned, is when a person looks at a figure and then discusses what they see. Example of the thematic apperception test is on the right, where you're given a picture, a scenario, and you tell a story about that picture. And the idea is that will reveal parts of your personality depending on what story you tell. There are also personality questionnaires, which, unlike projective tests, the answers are not open-ended. You're not just telling a story, but you're given an array of answers to pick from. For example, there may be, A might be none of the time, B might be some of the time, C all the time once you're given a scenario. Also, social media, which is a relatively new thing, but I think there's some research in the textbook that discusses that personality traits could be correlated with likes on Facebook. In other words, the idea is you could look at someone's social media or Facebook, look at their posts, their likes, all that stuff, and kind of get an idea of their personality. So that's a rather new idea. That's all I have for you on personality. Please reach out as usual with any questions or if you need help with anything. Thanks a lot.